right, good evening and welcome to Copperfield's Books virtual event with Zerlina Maxwell. My name is Jamie Madsen and I'm the Marketing and Events Coordinator here at Copperfield's Books, and I'll also be your host for the evening. I'm thrilled to inform you that all 9 of our stores are currently open for both inside service and curbside pickup between 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. every day. As COVID-19 continues to endanger the future of indie bookstores like us, we just wanted to take a moment and thank you for your continued support. Just a couple housekeeping items before we get started. We will be using the chat box to provide links to view upcoming Copperfield's events, links to purchase Zerlina's book, as well as a 10% discount code to use on our website. And we will also include my contact details for post-event information. Additionally, the Q&A box will be your go-to tonight with any comments or questions for the speaker. It will feature about 25 to 30 minutes of speaking, and Zerlina kind of wants us to be an open dialogue with how relevant the topic is right now. So we'll open up for a live Q&A after that. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see a Q&A icon. Please submit your questions here rather than replying to me in the chat box. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce tonight's author. Zerlina Maxwell is an MSNBC political analyst, commentator, speaker, and also a writer for many different media outlets. Formerly the director of progressive media for Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, she is now the senior director of progressive programming for SiriusXM. Her writing focuses on national politics, candidates, and specific policy and culture issues, including race, feminism, domestic violence, sexual assault, and victim blaming. Zerlina is with us this evening to discuss her latest book, The End of White Politics: How to Heal Our Liberal Divide, which seems pretty timely.
Yeah.
So I'm pleased to hand it over to you, Zerlina. Go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so happy that Copperfield wanted to have this conversation. It couldn't be more relevant in this moment, and I feel pretty lucky for a platform to be able to discuss issues that I've cared so deeply about. I'm a political junkie, lifelong political junkie, going back to when I was like 7 years old, arguing with my dad about the election in 1988, and without any prodding, that's how I started out. I absolutely have been obsessed with politics since then. And I've worked for 2 campaigns, both President Obama's 2008 campaign here in Virginia, actually, where ironically I'm quarantined as a escaped former Brooklynite. And I worked for Hillary Clinton in 2016 as the director of progressive media. And that meant that I got a pretty good window into the makeup of the progressive movement and the Democratic Party writ large. And I think that there was a lot that was done in the 2016 cycle that was done well. And obviously there was some things that we needed to work on, because the outcome of that election did not go how many progressives and feminists like myself wanted it to go. And in this moment, in quarantine, I think it's certainly one of those moments where you can say, we made a change. It's not going exactly well. And so I just wanted to get started by opening up with what everybody is probably thinking, which is, what are white politics? And what do you mean by the end of white politics? Because it is a very bold title. So I just want to thank everybody for taking the time out. And I hope this is an enlightening discussion because, as we said in the intro, it could not be more relevant. So I want to tell you why I wrote this book before I get into exactly what the title means. Because when I tell you why I wrote this book, I think you'll get a sense of what the title means. So I wrote this book as a clarion call for Democrats. I am somebody who has worked on 2 campaigns, like I said, and I care very much about the future of our country, but also the future of the movement that I have worked for in the past, and feel close to in the present, and understand that as our country is evolving, progressive policies that address the needs of everyday people is one of the most important things in a healthy democratic society. And so I wrote from that perspective. So it's a clarion call for Democrats who are best positioned to take advantage of America's demographic shifts and a push towards a more progressive future. So what are white politics? That's the first question that everybody asks me in every interview. And it's the question that most people have when they see just the cover of the book. So what are white politics? And what do you mean by the end of white politics? I don't even understand what white politics are. So the first question that people have is from the title. And trust me, I know it's bold, but it's very simple. It sounds like you're saying maybe the end of white people. Of course, I'm not saying that. Sounds like you might say it's the end of white America. Of course, I'm not saying that. Those are not related to anything I'm talking about. In fact, what I'm talking about is an expansion of the spectrum of concerns and the types of policies that we discuss in the mainstream space so that everyone's concerns are equally discussed and deemed important. Because I don't know if you noticed, but I certainly have noticed that from the beginning of time, we've been solely focused on white voters. That's pretty much since America's founding. And even though I wrote this book way before quarantine, I wrote this book last year, and I finished, as you'll see later in the chapter on Joe Biden, and in the final chapter on the future, it was around Super Tuesday. So obviously late February, early March, but before COVID. But that said, everything I'm saying is absolutely relevant now, particularly because, as we'll discuss later, Joe Biden, who is the nominee, selected Kamala Harris to be his running mate. And so I sit here and I ask everyone who is joined on their Thursday night, do you think things are going particularly well? We're all in quarantine. So certainly the way that we have been doing our politics and the way that we have been selecting our leaders to keep our families safe, frankly, is not going well. So what I mean is white identity politics. That's what I mean by white politics. So when I say the end of white politics, what I want is a place for everyone's concerns. And frankly, white identity politics is what we've been doing this whole time. And Donald Trump successfully exploited white identity politics. But we've usually left off the words white and identity when talking about politics and policy. And we may not even realize that we're doing that. Because we've been doing identity politics and we've been focused on white identity. We just called it politics. And we've reached a moment in 2020 that requires evolution to something new and something more inclusive, something better. So simply put, the end of white politics is putting an end to the central and solitary focus on white voters. Because I feel like we're at a place where we can say only focusing on one type of voter is not serving everyone well. And it's very outdated, especially in the Democratic Party, that does not need a majority of white voters to win. The Democrats have not won the white vote, a majority of it, since 1964. Barack Obama did not win a majority of the white vote. Bill Clinton did not win a majority of the white vote, and so forth. So the winning coalition of the future is frankly also the winning coalition of the past and the present. And as we sit here in 2020 with the election right on the horizon, it's important to understand where we're headed. According to Pew Research, white voters will be a minority of the American electorate by 2045. That's 25 years from now. And in states like California, where you are, or at least some of you are, I know, and in Texas, these numbers are already very much happening. So why wait until 2045 to implement a strategy that we know will work right now, and start moving and organizing like we're the majority of voters? And when I say we, I mean people who are not white and those who are white who want equity and justice for all Americans. And even beyond the demographic shifts that I've just outlined, what's also really important to understand is that we're also going through a generational shift. And I think Kamala Harris really represents, in a lot of different ways, a generational shift. She is 55 years old, and she was born in 1964. And she is a boomer, but right on the cusp there. And so we're shifting away from leadership that is solely white and of the baby boomer generation, and towards a more equitable representative democracy that includes more women, more people of color, and expands the spectrum of concerns that we actually discuss in public. So we don't have to wait till 2045. We can start now, because the generational shift is underway, and Generation Z and millennials, the largest and most diverse generation, are going to reshape our political environment in a transformational way, particularly because since the election of 2016, the turnout for young voters, those diverse and very progressive voters, has been higher even than expected in midterm and special elections. And so there are some prognosticators that say that in the upcoming 2020 election, all the caveats aside about the postal service and mail-in ballot access and all of these concerns that everyone is talking about in the current media environment, which are very important, turnout could be as high as 70% among very sporadic, meaning not frequent voters, infrequent voters, those younger and more diverse voters, and that will potentially have a transformational impact. So as we sit here the week that Joe Biden put Kamala Harris on his ticket, first Black woman to be on a major party's ticket, the first South Asian woman to be on a major party's ticket. It's important to emphasize, though, that while representation is important and critical, diversity and inclusion is way more than just having a picture that is pretty with a lot of different types of people in it. I think of it similarly to Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, who I believe represents the end of white politics that I'm talking about, the future. She looks at her job as a policymaker this way. She says the people closest to the pain should be the closest to the power. And our politics should be framed around the experiences we live and how that policy impacts people. It's about the impact on human beings, because at the end of the day, that is what matters. We've never had a woman president, even though women are 51% of the population. We've never had a Black woman president or vice president, even though turnout for Black women is 6 points higher than the average for every other demographic group of voters. We can do so much better than we're doing in terms of putting people in the halls of power who look like the people who elect those folks. And in my view, the people who have the same lived experiences as me and you will have a much better understanding of the needs of people who look like me and you. And I want those people setting the policy, particularly as we sit here in COVID. And as I said, I wrote this book before quarantine, but I feel so strongly that everyone understands what I'm saying when I say it is not going well and we can do better. And so I really want to emphasize tonight that I believe strongly lived experiences matter in policymaking. And I want to ask everyone at home one question. Okay, think about election night. There's all the things on all of the boards and everybody's in front of their screens, and maybe it's Steve Kornacki or someone else. This is no commentary on any specific channel. It's just a general observation. So, I'm a Black college educated woman. I also happen to have a law degree from Rutgers Law School. Did you ever wonder why the graphic on election night doesn't include me? And here's what I mean. You know how they go through the results and they'll do a slide and it'll be a pie chart of the breakdown of voters. And they'll do a slide for white voters over a certain age, or white voters with a certain level of education, or white voters with a certain marital status. And then what happens when they get to the slide about people who look like me? It says the Black vote, or for the Latinx folks, the Latino vote. And I feel like in this moment of 2020, we must insist that every other group of people get the privilege of nuance, and that Black people like me want to be included, and our concerns need to be included in the conversation. So we just have to change this. You know, I should get a slide on the screen just like every other type of American. And that's just a small way in which our focuses are too limiting. And I think in this moment of quarantine, you can agree with me when we need to expand what we're talking about, because the way we were doing things was not working. Once you expand the conversation and you expand the spectrum of concern, I think that's how you start to see the racial and gender disparities that we've been living with for generations. Once you expand the conversation and you talk openly about the impact of policy on people, you will be better able to understand why certain things are the way they are in our society, and also why they persist so long. So after the 2016 election, there was a hyper-focus. There still is a hyper-focus, in my view, on white working class men in 3 states. And you know what they are. You're at home, you're saying them to yourself. Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Because Donald Trump won the election by 77,000 votes in those 3 states, and it's all because Hillary Clinton didn't go to Wisconsin, or because Hillary Clinton didn't work hard enough to reach out on economic issues to turn out white working class voters. That's the narrative that we've been fed since 2016. It is wrong. White working class voters are important, and everyone should be talking to every type of person about the policies that impact our life and how to make their lives better and how to support their families and keep them safe. But the hyper focus on white working class voters obscured the fact that there were more Black voters who stayed home in those 3 states between 2016 and 2012. In fact, it's about 1 million. It's like 900,000, which is a bigger number, last I checked, than 77,000. So what are we doing in terms of expanding the conversation so those people see themselves in the political process and are inspired to turn out and participate? The other way that we also obscure other voters in our conversations, with our hyper focus on voters that, again, going back to, and this is just to make sure everyone's paying attention, going back to my earlier point, you don't need a majority of white voters to win the election. We tend to talk about white voters without saying so. And this just happened this week when the president tweeted about suburban housewives. So you'll notice this sometimes. They'll talk about suburban women and they don't tell you what they mean is white. They'll talk about evangelicals, but they don't tell you what they mean is white evangelicals, because Black and Latinx voters in those other groups do not vote for Republicans in the same rates that white voters do. And so it's important to actually talk about what those other groups of people are doing. Because if voter turnout in the United States hovers around 50%, there's a lot of folks that are not participating. And it's important to understand why they are not participating and what message may resonate. So in addition, when you're talking about, I just want to add one more point about Latinx voters. So in the same way that I'm not included in the graphic, we also just talk about Latino voters as if they're one monolithic group. And so anybody that knows, you're in California, anybody that knows how the Latinx community, the diversity of it, and understands that that is ridiculous, right? And so it's really important to allow for an expansion of the spectrum so that the Latinx vote, the Black vote, can be given all of the nuance that all of the white voters are given when they're the center of the discussion. So in 2016, there was a lot of opinions about what went wrong. And I participated in a lot of conversation about what went wrong in 2016. And so I wanted to read a few excerpts from the book to give you a sense of why I wrote it. And so that starts at a Politicon panel that happened in 2018 in Los Angeles. And it was a bunch of progressives who, you know, everybody had their own opinions about what went wrong in 2016. And one of the points I made, and it got quite a harsh response, was the fact that Bernie Sanders was not successful in the 2016 primary because of his inability to connect with Black women voters. And that is part of the reason why he lost the delegate count early on through the southern states. And that one point was met with boos and hisses. And so for me, that was the spark that brought this book to life, because I felt like if I didn't sit down and explain why we need to be able to speak to a diverse set of voters, and that while economic issues and a focus on economic inequality is important, racism has an impact on everything, and so does sexism. And the intersection of those two things is something you need to understand in order to speak to those diverse communities. So I'm going to read two excerpts from the book. And like I said, the first is why I wanted to write the book. And the second is why I think perhaps Joe Biden picked Kamala Harris. And you'll know what I mean when I get to that excerpt, because the title of that chapter is In Black Women We Trust. So let me go to the book. I'm going to read the first excerpt. It is from the introductory chapter. As I said, I was at Politicon in Los Angeles, and it was a conference where we were discussing, you know, what went wrong in 2016. The panel was what now, liberals? And there were a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters in the room, although it is a bipartisan conference. So there's people from all sides. There's some MAGA hats in the room and all of that. But it was a situation where people didn't shy away from letting you know what they thought about you, about Hillary Clinton, about all of it. So as I'm trying to make my points, this is what happens. And this is on page 8 of the book. If you have the book already, you can follow along at home. If you don't, make a note. And this is from page 8 in the introductory chapter, What Now, Liberals? The future of the Democratic Party depends on confronting the persistent challenges we face as a movement as we continue to lack self-awareness about our own biases. But what ended up being manifested at this large Politicon gathering was a messy intra-party bickering match about Democrats. The real enemy and challenge for everyone in that room was defeating Republicans and Donald Trump. But you wouldn't know that based on me having to be escorted out in the end by security. As each panelist laid out his or her analysis of what went wrong for Hillary and Democrats in 2016, the crowd became more vocal, both in their applause and with their loud booing of anyone who, like me, disagreed that Bernie's non-election wasn't the source of today's Trump madness. I'll say it again. Bernie not being successful in the primary has to do with certain aspects of his messages. It doesn't have to, it didn't cause Trump. And I think that we just have to accept that as a party and move forward with a more cohesive message towards all communities. I'll go back to the book. As the conversation turned to what needed to be done to win going forward, I shifted in my seat to get ready to say what they didn't want to hear. Future elections will be shaped and won by women of color. Then I added that all of the Democratic candidates would need to do a better job of speaking to and about the issues that impact Black women in particular. And they need to care about Black women the most if they want, in their issues primarily, if they want to win the 2020 Democratic nomination. And that's why Bernie didn't win in 2016. The crowd immediately reacted, and it wasn't pretty. Boo. They're booing me at this point. I looked up into the liberal-minded crowd, hissing and jeering at me, a bit taken aback by just how aggressive their reaction was to what was an obvious point about Bernie's potential vulnerabilities. But nevertheless, I persisted. I didn't want to let this crowd of predominantly boisterous Bernie supporters, still bitter from the 2016 primary, to distract me from participating in the panel. We are all Democrats after all. We are on the same team. In reality, all I was doing was stating the obvious. Bernie's weakness among Black women is well documented. I kept trying to make my point and back up my argument with data, like the fact that nearly a million Black voters who voted for President Obama in 2012 stayed home in 2016. In part, this disconnect exists because our party doesn't speak directly to those voters, including Bernie Sanders. Clearly, the folks in the audience weren't familiar with the statistics. Bernie Sanders is the candidate best positioned to engage Black women, Kyle Kulinski said. The crowd roared with applause. He was one of the other panelists, and he's the co-founder of Justice Democrats. And none of this is personal at all. This is just what happened on this panel. So I disagree with Kyle, of course, and I say wrong. Sanders lost in 2016 because he got trounced in the southern primary states where Black women gave Hillary Clinton the critical wins to amass the delegates needed to clinch the nomination. So I immediately clapped back. Bernie Sanders lost the primary by 4 million votes. And so while it is true that a lot of people of color and a lot of people generally still support Bernie, he did not win the primary. And the truth is that it was older Black voters, particularly older Black women, in South Carolina, in Alabama, in Arkansas, in those southern states that turned out for Hillary Clinton. And so we saw that again this cycle, didn't we, with Joe Biden? And while I have to give credit where it is due, Bernie Sanders did an excellent job improving his messaging towards communities of color, particularly Latinx voters. It just wasn't enough. But that's okay, because the moment that we're in now, and I'm going to go to the second excerpt, is evidence of the fact that perhaps I was onto something when I said that the electorate was absolutely ready for more representation and people of all backgrounds that speak to concerns of people of all backgrounds. So the next excerpt is from another chapter in the book, and it's titled, "In Black Women We Trust." And after this excerpt, I'm going to answer your questions, because we are sitting here in a moment where the first Black woman, the first South Asian woman, is a part of a major party's presidential ticket. And that feels like something where you don't want to be looking at a lady talk at you. You want to be a part of that discussion. So I'm going to read this excerpt, and then I would like to answer your questions. So please submit them in the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screens. So after the 2016 election, there was still a hyper-focus, even on the Democratic side, of white working class voters. Immediately after the 2016 election, in early 2017, the DNC went on a bus tour with Bernie Sanders to the Midwest. And I remember being a part of different roundtables and convenings where Black women were making the point that Black women were winning these elections. For Doug Jones, for so many folks who probably wouldn't have been reelected, but Black women turn out, and they turn the whole church pew out, as Reverend Leah Daughtry likes to say, or they grab their nephew and everybody on the block to turn out. They go souls to the polls. And so why not focus on those women who are already organizing themselves? Why not exploit the power that Black women already have? I think Joe Biden got the message. And I don't know if he's read the book, but I do know some people on his campaign, and maybe they read the book. Maybe, I'm not sure. So, okay, I'm going to read from In Black Women We Trust, and then open it up for some questions. Okay. After the 2016 election, Higher Heights for America, which is a PAC for Black women that supports Black women candidates, wrote a letter to the Democratic Party saying the following: Black women have consistently shown up for Democrats as a loyal voting bloc, demonstrating time and again that we are crucial to the protection of progressive policies such as economic security, affordable health care, and criminal justice reform. We have voted and organized our communities with little support or investment from the Democratic Party for voter mobilization efforts, like civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer, who testified at the 1964 Democratic Convention demanding Blacks have a seat and voice within the party. We are sick and tired of being sick and tired. The Democratic Party has a real problem on its hands. Well, maybe not as big of a problem after yesterday. Black female voters are the very foundation of a winning coalition. Yet most Black voters feel like Democrats take them for granted. The party's foundation has a growing crack, and if it is not addressed quickly, the party will fall even further behind and ultimately fall in its quest to strengthen its political prospects. The Higher Heights letter should serve as a handy to-do list for the Democratic Party. DNC Chairman Tom Perez did eventually convene these Black women leaders to discuss the issues highlighted in their letter, but these concerns aren't ones that can be solved with just a few meetings, or I guess they're doing Zoom meetings now. It has to be a sustained effort that allows Black women in particular to set the agenda from positions of power. Because right now, our voting power demands it. We vote at a rate that is a full 6% higher than the national average. So why wouldn't you want us in your corner? Fortune magazine noted that according to the US Census Bureau's current population survey voting and registration supplement, just over 70% of eligible Black women voters cast ballots in 2012, compared to 65% of white women, 62% of white men, 61% of Black men, and 59% of women of color overall. With numbers like this, it's obvious that Black women are a key voting demographic. And let's keep in mind, the truth is that Trump did steal away some of the Black male vote. He represented the kind of brash and unabashed toxic masculinity that some men of color aspire to. Not all, but yes, some. And we have to be honest about this dynamic within communities of color. Sexism and racism are a stew of bigotry, but they can both exist alone and manifest at the same time in many different ways. Trump's misogyny didn't deter 13% of Black men from voting for a man who said the first Black president wasn't legitimate or even American. That's a lot to overlook if you live every day as a Black man with the daily slights and sometimes egregious examples of bigotry and violence. But they did. And it's not a coincidence that the alternative was a woman named Hillary Clinton, and that they would have rather seen a racist white man in the Oval Office than a woman speaks volumes. I do hate to say this, but some Black men don't want all people to be equal. Some want to be equal to white men and ultimately dominant over all colors of women. Imagine this: anti-Black racism and bias isn't the only race-based discrimination that women of color face. Sometimes the call is coming from inside the house. We also face bias from within, a vestige of our Black American history dating back to slavery. At the core of it all is always either the notion in actuality or interference of white people, For example, during Kamala Harris's run, and this is why this section is relevant to this conversation today of all days. During Kamala Harris's run for the 2020 Democratic nomination, some Black men distrusted her. They saw her as not sufficiently loyal to the race because her husband is white. I called that out on MSNBC because it's bullcrap. We're better than that. And also, she has a lot of characteristics in her policy and messaging that demonstrates that she knows exactly who she is, and we have to move beyond some of the old ways of thinking about this stuff. So, last thing I'll say on this is, in the past 24 hours, I have vacillated from moments of just extreme joy to vigilance in this moment as I sit here, because I know as a Black woman that Kamala Harris will face more attacks and scrutiny because of who she is than any other vice presidential pick in American history. But that's why we have to have these conversations, and that's why we have to expand the spectrum of concern to include everyone. I think that Joe Biden picked Kamala Harris because he understands this. He said he wants to be a transitional figure to the next generation. And I believe the next generation, they look like the squad. They look like me. They look like you. But they don't look like the leaders that we have traditionally had in the past. And that's a good thing. So I want to open it up for some questions. I think there are some in the bottom. Okay.
Do you want me to funnel them to you, or do you want to just take them?
I will just, do I just click answer live? I'll just answer
just read them out loud and
I'll
answer.
read them out. Yeah, that's the best way, I think. Great. So thank you, Patrick, for your question. Patrick asks, I was surprised you were hissed for suggesting that Bernie lost because he failed to garner a Black women's vote. The fact that you were tells me the naysayers were out of touch. Thank you. As I recall, the lack of support was well understood at the time. Am I way off the mark? No, I thought this was understood. That's why I mean, even if you go and watch the tape of this panel, and frankly, the panel in 2019 was also the same. It was the same kind of thing. There was a moment where I believe it was Joe Lockhart, the press secretary for Bill Clinton, was on the panel. It was like me, James Carville, one of my other friends from the campaign, Jess McIntosh, my co-host for my radio show Signal Boost on SiriusXM. She was on the panel, and it was basically the same. Kyle Kulinski was on it again, and somebody mentioned the name Amy Klobuchar, and the Bernie folks started booing. And I was like, what are you guys doing? You can't, we're not doing this. This is not what we do. We I think, I'm obviously writing this as a we, and that of who I used to work for. I used to work for Democrats. Obviously, I've transitioned to another place, but I'm trying to use my excuse me, wisdom and expertise from those experiences to help the party as they move forward. So Patrick, no, you're not way off the mark. That panel in 2019 showed me that we have a lot of work to do around the issues of race and gender on the progressive left. And we have to call it out when we see it. So, the people that get upset by, the assertion that there may be a strain of Bernie supporter, that is not all Bernie supporters, but is a small minority of some of his supporters that are acting in a way that don't align with our values, then we need to call that out. And we need to be not tolerant of that kind of bullying behavior. Because I feel like on the progressive left, we understand why that's so damaging, and that silences voices of people who are already marginalized in so many other ways. Kim, thank you for your question. Good question. So can the author give her opinion on voter suppression, including gutting the post office? What can we do now? Okay, this is a really good question. So the funding that there's $3.6 billion in the package, is proposed. It's in the House bill that was passed on May 15th. And right now the Senate has gone to recess until September, which I find interesting because they still have work to do. We're in pandemic and people don't get their checks anymore and are being evicted. And so now they're going home to vacation. I guess that must be nice. But there's funding in that House bill. So they're debating funding, which is to scale up many of the voting, the pieces of the voting infrastructure that make mail-in voting work. And today, Donald Trump said that he's opposed to, the funding that's included, which is absolutely voter suppression. He's trying to, I think, limit the access that people have to vote him out of office. And that's very scary. We're in a very scary place right now. But what you can do in this moment is tell everybody about the fact that funding is in this bill. Like the mail-in voting funding is in the bill they're debating right now. So you need to call all of the Congress people that you can call. You need to call people who live in states that have Republican representatives. We need to put pressure on the people in those battleground states, those senators like Cory Gardner or Democrats need to put pressure, people who are aligning with Democrats need to put pressure on those swing state senators. That would be a smart strategy, and start there. But that's a really good question because it's something that's happening literally today. Donald Trump said that he doesn't want to increase that funding. And that's what that funding is for. It's to ensure that everybody's able to participate in the upcoming election. Patrick has another question. This may be a stupid question. No stupid questions. Am I good with Kamala Harris, or am I hoping for a more progressive nominee? I certainly was hoping for a more progressive presidential nominee. And to be clear, if Kamala Harris was the nominee, that's a more progressive nominee than Joe Biden, right? So I do consider Kamala Harris a progressive. I think that she's a progressive nominee for pick for vice president, and I think she would have been a progressive choice for president. But I do think it's very interesting the ways in which the narrative has made her into some sort of moderate. I was like, she was marrying people in 2004, before Joe Biden even said he was for marriage equality on television, right? Think about what was happening in 2004. You guys are in California and right in her neck of the woods, right? So, that was a progressive thing that she did back then. Certainly her record can be scrutinized. Everybody's record should be scrutinized fairly. But I think it's important actually to establish as a baseline that Kamala Harris is a progressive. Okay. Maria, thank you for your question. How does legalizing, decriminalizing drugs in order to lower incarceration, recidivism, and addiction, how do these issues play out in African-American female demographic? It's a good question. I'm for legalizing marijuana on the national level. I'm also, obviously very critical of mass incarceration and the fact that, there are certain people in certain states like California, for example, where you can become a millionaire off of the same thing that somebody can be jailed for. That feels very un-American to me. And I feel like this is one place in which we can easily make a legislative change, a policy change that will definitely impact generations, right? And it doesn't just impact Black women. Think about, the fact that entire communities are sort of like, expanded out from sort of the matriarchs and those women of different generations that, protect the community, take care of the community. And certainly women who are incarcerated, or even people in your family who are incarcerated, when they're not there, that impacts more than just that one person. So certainly I think mass incarceration is an issue that impacts Black women. And I think that if you focus not just on that, but the ways in which you can uplift women and communities writ large to create an environment where you have less incarceration because people have good jobs, they have good schools, they have good healthcare, they have good housing. That's how you make a more progressive and a better society. And yes, I think it does start with decriminalizing things for sure. Arlene has a question. Thank you for your question. I fear that it doesn't matter who goes out to vote if we have a quote unquote president who will do anything to stay in power. I have that same fear, but I do know that there are so many more people who disapprove of child separation, who believe that we, should treat people equally under the law, that, law enforcement that kills citizens or kills individuals who, are unarmed or just simply alive and could be arrested, or maybe, how about we de-escalate situations? I think it's really important that we understand that our participation allows those structures to change. So it's horrifying to think that he could stay in power, even if we, all vote our hearts out. But I have to be optimistic. You know, I have family members who who marched in Selma so I could vote, so they could vote. So I feel optimistic that we will be able to see the light at the end of this tunnel. That's a good question. Marge, we have 1 more minute, so I will answer these as quickly as I can. Marge, how do you see the never Trumpers and the left-leaning folks bridging after we all elect Biden? That's a good question. I think that what I hope is that we can go back to just a serious policy discussion where people have different points of view on a variety of policy issues, and then we have a debate about substance based in fact. How about that, right? I mean, I just feel like we so desperately need that because we haven't had it for so long. I feel like we haven't had it in like 20 years or something like that. It just feels like, you know, we just have been operating in a debate that is premised in bad faith. And I just want to have a serious conversation where both sides come to the table in good faith, state their positions, and then, you know, we come to some sort of compromise. I think that's what we're all about. I think that's all the questions, I believe.
Awesome. Definitely lots of thank yous are pouring in.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad everybody was able to join. I mean, if you're, you know, watching and you're like, what can I do? I just want to say that tell everybody that you know, and I'm telling you because I do this now with everybody, is don't think of election day as November the 3rd. Election day is right the second, because you have to ask yourself how you're going to vote, whether you're going to go in person or whether you're going to vote by mail. You make that decision, and then if you're going to vote by mail, you can figure out how you're going to go about doing that, because there's usually a couple steps depending upon where you live. So if you are voting by mail, you can print out that application today and get started. So I tell everybody now, election day is today. And I just wanted to end there because I think people want to see, you know, changes, but they're not sure where to start. So I would start by going to when we all vote and figuring out the best way for you to participate.
That was so great, Zerlina. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you to all who attended. I will be sending out an email with a link to this recording as well as the code for your discount, which is Maxwell. And yeah, hope to see you all very soon.
Great. Thank you. Everybody have a safe night.
Yeah, you too. Good night.
Thanks.